It's George Hathaway here. You might direct them to my book.
Yeah, no, I would love to,
there
George.
Might be some explanation.
Yeah, well, and George, if you'd be open to it, would you be open to speaking on this? This is, sir, this is your bailiwick. I'm a horrible reporter compared to you.
No, there are other questions before me, so I'll sign out until the appropriate time. But yeah, I can answer some questions should people be interested in asking.
Well,
Tim, are you asking if you'll do a presentation in the future? Is what you're asking? Correct?
Well, yeah, George, if you would be open to it, I would love to have you on to do a presentation. Or if anyone has questions for George, if you'd be, you know. So do you want to do this since we have George with us? Does anyone? Yeah, I see Jeremy Reese is getting excited. Jeremy, would you like to ask a question for George?
Probably lots of people.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have access to a bunch of equipment at the lab right now, and I was curious, you know, like we got to do an experiment and try to test this on some block of aluminum or something, and because that's what the metal that he used in that experiment was, aluminum, right?
Are you asking me what?
Yeah, I want to know like I want to know specifics on metallurgy for setting up an experiment, and I want to know specifics on what kind of equipment we should be.
That would take a long time.
Well, they could probably learn from your book, right, George?
Yes.
Oh, there goes my audio.
Might be a better idea. Go through the book, which is called the Hutchison Files. And I think it's 1991 to 1995, something like that. I don't, unfortunately, have a copy of it with me at the moment, but you can get it from Integrity Research or Tom Vallone's website, Integrity Research, and he's selling the book at the moment on my behalf. Okay,
and I'm going to write that down as well. So the Hutchison Files, 1915 through Integrity. But now, George, the majority of your work was in the 1980s, right? When you guys analyzed this.
That's correct.
Yeah. And then hopefully I didn't get any facts wrong. I've had to kind of piece things together, and it's been quite a while since I've covered this.
Well, there are a few stretches here and there, but I should say that my involvement was in the late 80s and the early 90s, and that was the time when the most interesting effects were going on and the most material was being produced, the most unusual levitations, of which I saw some. I saw metal breaking apart, and I saw weird stuff happening with liquids and semi-solids, along with other people, and tried to document it. But then as time went on into the late 90s, John was involved with other folk. Our involvement with John Alexander had stopped at that time. And then as the 2000s broke, John became much more involved with media and was much more interested in, thank you very much, Tim.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Much more involved with trying to retrieve, I should say, his innate gifts, which unfortunately, in my opinion, had dissipated to a large extent. And he was no longer able to perform, you might say, the same kinds of feats that he had been able to in the time that I was involved, which happens with others as well, of the same mindset, you might say, or the same kind of approach, a conscious approach and a conscious affinity to the machinery that he was using. And I get into that a little bit in the book too. So anyway.
Has anyone continued this work, or do you know of anyone that has also replicated this work, or anyone that has
No
worked,
one,
or you guys just worked, just you and John, and then that was it?
no one attempted to do the kinds of analysis that I did, even though my analysis was with rather crude equipment. Tim might have, according to your intro to this and Mark's intro to this meeting, Tim was going to show some scope traces. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get on right away.
Oh, yeah. And I did, George, I did show those. Those are the ones that
Okay.
you gave to John, and then he let me photograph those. So
Yes, and they're reproduced, some of them in the book. I was surprised that that no one actually took the time, first of all, to believe that there was something unusual going on, and secondly, to try to instrument it better than I could, and try to determine what, at least electromagnetically or electrostatically, was going on. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and it has not happened since, primarily because, in my opinion, John lost the ability to affect the metal in the way that he had during the time that I was involved. There were some minor effects, as Tim has shown in some of the presentations tonight, after the 2000, the late 1990s. But to answer your question, Jeremy, no, I am not aware of anyone who has been able to have an effect in front of them, as I had, have some equipment, as I did, in a space that would allow some kind of coherent measurement, which was barely possible with me, as you saw with Tim's presentation of how dense that at least that lab in New West was. And I didn't do tests in that New West lab, but I saw it. I was there for sure. So sadly, no one has picked this up, and I'm afraid to say that the likelihood of someone actually being able to test and measure what John was able to produce has basically vanishingly small.
So one more question. I thought in some of the older videos, it said that people from the U.S. Navy sent some scientists there to observe the work and take note of it at some point. When did that occur? And any details about that? And did things stop working mysteriously after they visited the lab? Or
you may be referring to what Tim presented with Colonel Alexander. I'm not sure whether that is what you're referring to. I am not aware that there was a specific U.S. Navy deposition. There certainly was from that John Alexander put together a team from Los Alamos, and that was the team that came up under my supervision and my associate Alex Pizarro, who were working with John. And we had arranged with John Hutchison. We had arranged with John Alexander to come up and try to figure out with some of their equipment, which was very minimal, because most of them didn't believe that they were going to see anything unusual. So they only brought the most not primitive, but the minimalist equipment.
okay.
And that was in the early 90s, as far as I recall. Most unfortunately, due to John's mental state at the time, he was so concerned that he wanted to make a positive show, you might say, that the only thing unusual that happened was that a transformer blew up and a few things fell over way at the back of this large warehouse that we had arranged for these demonstrations to take place. The folk from Los Alamos some of the, two of them were believers, including John Alexander, that there was something unusual that had happened. And the remainder of them were either neutral or one was highly skeptical. And the one that was highly skeptical was a physicist who John Alexander had arranged to come. And this physicist put the kibosh on it, said, this is total crap. We didn't see anything that John had and George had claimed that we would see. And therefore we should give up. And unfortunately, although John Alexander wanted to pursue it more, we were not able to continue with that contingent from Los Alamos. Other folk had come up from time to time, as Tim has talked about. They saw this or that very minimal activity, nothing like what Alex Pizarro, myself, and a couple of others, as I mentioned in the book, actually saw with their own eyes and touched the material, gave John pristine material to put into the field and have it destroy itself or lift up. So unfortunately, I guess the long-winded answer to your question is the group from the US, the Los Alamos group, went away essentially empty-handed.
Now, George, if it's okay to ask, do you subscribe, because from what you're saying tonight, it sounds like when you say he's lost the effect, do you subscribe to this idea that John has some kind of a psychic connection to it?
Yes, that's the only, that is the only remaining reasonable, given what I know about electromagnetism, which is a fair amount. I'm an electrical engineer, and I've studied really wild electrical and electromagnetic effects in my past. And I've also studied the effects that the mind can have, if you might say, or the consciousness can have on materials, not John's, but others, that as if I have 5 possible explanations, 4 of which are so-called electromagnetic, one of which I'll remind you in the book was by Tom Bearden. He claimed that he figured out what was going on, and I don't subscribe to that. But if you give me 5 possibilities, one of which was some kind of consciousness connection, which was amplified perhaps by the electrostatic fields or something like that, I'm not saying that is it. I'm saying that is the most reasonable one that fits all the parameters that I'm aware of. And
Well,
therefore, if you are not in the John Hutchison are not in the mindset that has produced these kinds of effects in the past, they won't occur, no matter what kind of material, no matter what kind of fields you concoct, Tesla or Van de Graaff or KU band or whatever. And that was borne out by the fact that early on, John suffered, before I met him, and I knew him, but before I actually met him, from some somewhat serious mental health disorders, I'll put it mildly. And he had some, let's say, pharmaceutical assistance. And during that time, he was suffering. And it was during the time he was suffering that most of the effects of the strongest effects occurred. As he became more and more, you might say, normal by the use of some pharmaceuticals that helped him out, he lost the ability. Slowly, it pinched off. And as he became, you might say, his now John Hutchison self, playful, energetic, a bit screwy, you might say, as Berndt has talked about. The effect disappeared, or at least it became minimal. And so, and this has happened, I've followed this kind of thing in other folk as well. It's not unusual.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And, you know, I've never heard that piece of it before, but that does explain it a lot more, I think, you know.
Well, it gives you, it gives you pause to think, at least, that if the mind is in a particular state, perhaps of agitation or of over a heightened emotional state. You've heard where, I mean, it's well documented, for instance, that someone who is very slight of build, perhaps a woman who sees their child about to be run over by a car, can lift the car up with one arm and exhibit extreme feats of what you'd consider unusual capability in a super agitated state. And this might have been associated with what John was able to produce and concentrate on.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because it's, you know, I've heard, see that, and that was my concern about the SRI stuff, was I always looked at it like cart before the horse, because they went out hunting for psychic stuff. But the way that you're describing it now, it's a much more rational approach, I guess, to you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just even more confused, because it's like I'm asking for some keys. Like I was expecting like a frequency range, or, you know, a certain voltage, or some, you know, some limit that you have, the energy that you have to pump into a certain amount of vacuum space to get this type of effect, or you know, the right frequency for metal. But it's like, you're telling us that the secret to this is to take drugs and change your mind state and use telekinesis. And
no, what I'll answer your first question. I was with John long enough that he went through about 4 or 5 different iterations of his setup. He started with Tesla coil A and Van de Graaff B and a medium wave oscillator C, and the next, and stuff happened. Then he moved to, he removed one piece and he put another in, a specially wound coil. Then he, when we moved him from his Lynn Valley operation to another location prior to the one that I was talking about with regard to the US folk coming up, he had a completely different, he had a different Tesla coil. He'd wound his own new, larger Tesla coil. He had a different, he actually got rid of the Van de Graaff. He used a different kind of AC RF device. He still got the same wonderful activity. So the stuff that I documented, you might say, is just one little slice at one time of one setup that showed an amazing effects. Then he would change it and do something else, and he would get the same effect. Of course, it would take a long time, maybe 6 hours, as he was adjusting, as Tim was saying, you know, adjusting this and that. Who knows what he was doing? Was he thinking about something while he was adjusting? Was he actually considering that, you know, adjusting a frequency of some naval device made a difference? I don't know, but that is why I am concerned that people try to grasp a specific experimental setup to see whether they can reproduce the effect. More power to you if you can. Wonderful, that would be great. My concern is that so many people have tried this, and I know since 1997 or so, and the early 2000s, 3 or 4 folk that I know have tried to set up the same kind of thing that they saw in one instance of what John set up, and failed completely. I mean, there's absolutely nothing happened as one would expect, you might say. In my opinion, they were missing a fundamental ingredient, and that was maybe something up here, or someone else is up here, or wherever you want to locate consciousness.
And of course, the physicists are going to ask, well, if we're emitting something from our brains, how do we measure it and how do we detect it? And there's this whole thing of biophotons. I don't know if you've heard of these, but
yeah, I've gone through it all. Anyway,
those might be something worth looking into in connection with it, but it's certainly interesting.
Killerian frequency, is it called? The Killerian frequency?
Krillian?
Killerian.
No, there's
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Is there a documented wave list of the frequencies John was working with? I'm just interested for my own electrolysis experiments on what ranges maybe to try. Just putting into trying to get some more transmutations out of the electrolysis that I'm currently doing.
So are you asking me, or are you asking?
Oh,
yeah, George, or the community in general, just either or.
Yeah, I mean, George is a million times better to answer any of these questions than I am. I didn't know he would be here, but I'm incredibly appreciative, sir.
George, are you saying that John Hutchison had telekinetic power back then?
I don't know. All I can say is that the best guess that I can come up with is that he did not have telekinetic power, but that he used electromagnetic fields of some sort to amplify or ride on to do what he did. So it was a combination of the kinds of equipment, the spark gaps producing all sorts of noise, therefore no specific frequency, Bernard, and other and all sorts of other weird and wonderful devices, along with his concentration, whatever it was. One thing I don't know, and I was not there at the time, is whether any of his subsequent experiments after the time I was with him, which was finished off basically in the mid to late 90s, could be ascribed to his own, you might say, telekinesis. In other words, could he move anything without a spark gap going off, without a Tesla coil in the background, without a Van de Graaff machine? I don't know. That I don't know. If that was the case, then you might say, given that someone had made sure this wasn't a hoax and that John wasn't fooling somebody, then you might ascribe it to some kind of telekinesis. But I don't know.
George, Mark Sokol here from Falcon Space. Have you had any success with Alcephon working with Daniel? I know you guys worked on it a couple of years ago.
Is this the space to answer that question, Tim? You might want to moderate.
Sure. No, George, I honestly, I
don't
can't thank you enough for joining us. So yeah, I would say go for it. Whatever you want to speak on, sir.
Well, I was assuming that I would be answering some questions about Hutchison too, but I'll answer Mark's quickly. We've had some unusual effects, let's say, but that was quite a few years ago when we had a sample that was dancing around inside an EPR tube at liquid helium temperatures, and So it gave us hope that at least at X band there was something unusual, and we are attempting to gather together some funds to continue the experiments at S band, which is around 3 gigahertz.
Okay, that was with the Ruby sample, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and was the dancing the interesting component?
Yes, it it was the interesting component.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you.
Right.
Yeah, and so, yeah, I guess anyone else with Hutchison questions for George, and again, George, I can't thank you enough. It's truly an honor to have you on APEC.
Okay, appreciate it. George, if I may, one question. Since you are describing what you just said, a statement that equipment plus his mind may have displayed some kinesis, don't you think that if equipment and the human mind can do that, then wouldn't it be like an assembling the equipment that Hutchison had and the human mind that people can learn to use to have personal telekinetic power? And that's it. I mean, would that be that formula by assembling those equipment and training something like that? Would that summarize basically what you're saying?
I would love to have said that. However, I cannot say that for sure, for several reasons. First of all, there is no single setup that John used that you could put your finger on and say, that is the one that you should use. This is more or less to answer Jeremy's question. That is the kind of equipment that you should use, and then you should try to concentrate or go into a meditative state or do something like that. I can't say that that is the way. I personally, I doubt that's going to happen. First of all, in my opinion, you have to have the consciousness part, you might say, has to be somewhat unusual. So the average type person like me, who has, I would say, an average brain, I guess, and an average outlook on life, compared to John when I knew him, there was stability and astability. I would be the stable one. John, you might say, would be unstable at the time. So how do you judge, how do you measure that degree of difference in consciousnesses? Can you simulate that? Can you come up with some meditative state or something of that nature? I don't know. Can you, and that's only one half of it, given that my hypothesis, not my belief, but my hypothesis, remember those 5, that the one that has consciousness and electromagnetism might be the best one. I'm not saying it is, but assuming that there's some validity to that one, you got 2 components. You got the mind and you've got materials or fields. Well, how do you set up the fields? When you look at the stuff that the scope traces that Tim probably put up, you can't make heads or tails of it. I mean, there may be one frequency at 300 megahertz or 30 megahertz or something like that, but the next time we tested it, it was all over the map. It was somewhere else. If you got spark gaps and things like that flashing around, you have no idea what at least in John's case, what the fundamental frequencies are that you're dealing with. So unfortunately, it's still all over the map. The only thing for sure is that somehow John needed to be in a space with his materials that he made himself primarily, or he fixed himself, or he had some, you might say, visceral connection with, to have the effect as strongly as he did. And I'll give you another time type example. After I had to leave the situation, he hitched up with, or another group, a couple of guys who wanted to fund him, thinking they would make billions on John's technology for spaceships and anti-gravity machines and things like that. They set him up in a lab, and he was able to do a few things with his equipment in their lab. This was in the late 90s. And they said, it's great. Okay, John, you go away and we'll try to operate it ourselves. So they tried to operate exactly the way John did. They documented how he twisted dials on various machines and where he put the various devices, the Van de Graaff and the Tesla coils and things like that. When he had them in that case, they couldn't do it. They could maybe get a little bit of electrostatic movement, but anyone can do that with a Van de Graaff or a Tesla coil. Everyone probably on this list probably knows quite well. But no way were they able to get any kind of motion or breaking of bars apart or liquids flying around until John came back, spent about 3 hours. They said, okay, come on back, get in here. It was the next day. They hadn't touched the material. John started to fiddle, exactly the same setup. And suddenly things started to go. Not as much as when we were there with him, but he was starting to break metal apart and that kind of stuff. So in my opinion, it was, that was another sort of confirmation that John needed to be an integral part of this system for things to happen. I don't know how. I'm just postulating that it might be a consciousness thing, or I don't know, but or maybe he just was so attuned, like that lathe operator, whoever said before, that he could set whatever material, whatever machinery that was put before him into a particular state and stuff would happen. That I find hard to believe. I believe, at least hypothesize, that it happened, it had to be part of him, as opposed to what he could fiddle with, or in addition to, I should say, what he could fiddle with. So unfortunately, what I've been talking about just now breaks open all of this discussion about frequencies and wavelengths and materials and types of Van de Graaff machines and all that material. It opens, it expands it into a real miasma of possibilities.
George, can I quickly ask you, as an example kind of what people are saying, like John's psychic ability more? For instance, when I was first experimenting with electrolysis, I just had a D battery hooked up to a little saltwater solution with 2 coils. The battery had been dead for a few days. And then I walked in with my friend and I looked at it. I'm like, it's going to start bubbling. And lo and behold, the SOB started bubbling and we were like, whoa, it actually happened. So is that sort of the example you'd kind of give in relation to John and his experiments?
Well, if you were able to do that under what might be considered control conditions, in other words, repeat it, have someone document it, someone independently, you can't independently try it, because if you're a fundamental part of it, you can't have someone else.
The Schrodinger effect, correct?
Then you might have something. You might be able to claim that there's some some interaction between you and the experiment. I'll contrast that to John. Almost every time he was approaching and fiddling with his equipment, something unusual happened. As opposed to, in your case, once something happened. I'm not denying or downplaying what you're saying, but compared to John, John had this ability to eventually have something happen. Sometimes it took an hour, sometimes it took half an hour, sometimes
For
more
sure.
often it took
That's
about
amazing.
6 hours while we stood around waiting, and he would be testing things with his fluorescent bulb, and he'd be moving things a little bit here and there, and then he'd go back and fiddle with some tuner on a piece of surplus equipment. And Alex and I would be saying, okay, John, any idea when things might happen? Oh yeah, it's almost any time now. And 2 hours later, yep, something happened.
I see how
do
you're
you-
saying it's so hard to reproduce John's controlled
Yeah.
experiments.
Do you think, George, do you think it might, was he, would you describe him as being in like a dissociative state? When he did
That's
these
hard
things?
to say. He was all, I wouldn't say it was dissociative. He was with you. I mean, he would answer questions. He would be focused on the machine, on the equipment, but he would know you're in the background. And he'd say, "How you doing, guys? You know, it's maybe taking a little longer than I thought." He usually have his headphones on, and he's listening to the static
So
from.
he was almost consciously within the entire room, you're saying, like
Yeah, he
been able
knew
to
he
hear
knew
you because
that.
his headphones were on, yet he knew you guys were like coming up to ask him a question, sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't know whether you call that. I don't think that's dissociative, but
Yeah, because he
Higher
was aware.
dimensional consciousness almost.
he was, you might say, hyper aware. He certainly was hyper aware of his apparatus. He knew because he'd built it, he'd put it together, and it was something, you know, so part of him. But he knew that you were there. He knew that the Los Alamos guys were there. He was trying desperately to show them something. Unfortunately, it was too desperate, and
Tim,
didn't work out.
Yeah.
Tim,
Harold, yes.
you heard that, you know, I mean, we heard all the presentation that Jack Sarfati did about how the CIA was interested in consciousness and how studying the action of consciousness
Yeah, and
on
see,
the
and that was
material world. And what George is saying right now, what is your
well.
intake on that?
So this, and again, George could speak to this probably better than I could, but this goes back to the Stanford research, the SRI stuff. This goes back to remote viewing. John Alexander was involved with the remote viewing, and they were at SRI. They were investigating all sorts of stuff. And if I understand correctly, that is where their involvement with Hutchison came from, because they said, okay, here's another anomaly we can look at, right? So
Yeah, that was basically it. They were looking for remote viewers. They were looking for clairvoyance. They were looking for anything that would help them counteract the apparent Russian threat of the same the same kinds of things, and this was part of their mandate. And when they heard about, well, I'd known John separately, and when I told him, and my friend Alex Pizarro, actually it was Alex, told him through when they were both at a not a parapsychological, it was American something parapsychological association meeting. John was there, and my associate Alex Pizarro was there. Alex said, "You might be interested in this guy, John Hutchison. He's able to do this and that. And as close as we can reckon, he's probably doing it might have some consciousness associated with it. That's when John Alexander perked up his ears and said, gee, that sort of fits in with what we're trying to look for. And so he put together the team, John Alexander, to come up and see whether there was something to it, and that they could help the Army in its quest for understanding the role of consciousness in intelligence gathering, in possibly weaponizing weapons development, I guess, although he didn't say that exactly. But that was how that was the approach that the Los Alamos team under Alexander came up to see John.
George, what do you think is the state of development in that area today? Does it continue, or it stop, or it may be some black box project, one of the black projects? What is it?
Once again, how much time do you have? And this might not be the best place to talk about that.
Oh, okay. Summarize it.
Well,
yes or no?
that would be up. Yeah, that would be up to
Exactly.
George.
We have all the time to listen to these legends. And
Well,
stories.
and you know what we probably should do is just kind of we'll just call
George.
this open discussion, but yeah, we'll just kind of let it roll from here. Well, let me do some questions. Actually, Charlie had a question, so let me go to Charlie next, who's been very patiently waiting.
Thank you. Hey, George Hathaway. Yeah, I'm also an electrical engineer, so I'm very interested in Hutchison Effect. But he recently said in some videos from John Hutchison that he does not believe it's his psychic abilities affecting the materials. So I'm wondering what gave you the idea that it was his psychic ability, and where else have you seen that in effect, creating the Hutchison similar effects?
The reason I hypothesize that is, as I brought up before, the system only worked when he was there. And it didn't matter what kind of machinery was put in place, what kind of fields, you might say electromagnetic fields were, as far as we could measure, were in place. It had to be him there. Whether he was fiddling with it, sometimes it would work, by the way, when he wasn't fiddling with it. He just would sit there and suddenly something would happen. So that gave me the idea that this was more than just somebody putting together a unique set of fields by some, coil arrangements and spark gaps and stuff like that. And I had studied and continue to study folk that have abilities. The easiest example is spoon bending. We'll call it, just think about spoon bending for an example. People I've seen can hold up a spoon and you rub it a little bit, then you hold it up, and on the count of three, Jack Houck, who actually saw John Hutchison do his thing, would have a party and people would get all worked up and get excited, and then he'd say, okay, everyone's up in a state of heightened activity. On the count of three, your spoon is going to bend. And one or two people out of a room of 30 would see this thing bend, including John Alexander, by the way, who did it himself. So that's a minor example of a sort of confirmation that there's something weird going on between matter and consciousness, in my opinion. So it didn't bother me too much to go out on a limb as an electrical engineer and say, we're missing something here that John Hutchison and others have demonstrated. I don't know whether that's answering your question, but maybe partially.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Let me see. Well, does anyone else have questions? Oh, Nils, go for it, sir.
All right. Yeah, I really love the answers from George here, and that actually answered my question 100% exactly to the point, because I read years ago that Hutchison was able to produce these mysterious effects, but it was only when he was in the room. When he walked out of the room, things stopped working. So I concluded even years ago that this must have been some poltergeist effect from his subconscious. He probably wasn't even aware of it himself, that he was actually, or his subconscious was actually doing it. But now that I heard George address this, I am very happy and very pleased to confirm my suspicion about this. And this actually relates back to Charles and the Graviflyer again. Perhaps there is some subconscious effect here with the Russian guy, where he has some effect on this device levitating from the ground. If there's no real physics or real electromagnetic phenomena going on, what do you think, or what does the community think?
I could, Niels, I'm going to drift from your question just for a second to address something that Charles brought up that I forgot. Charles said that John Hutchison now and has claimed for some time that he doesn't think his mind has anything to do with it. It was all the apparatus. That is a recent that is a recent admission by John. During the time I was with him, he didn't know. He was ambivalent. He thought, yeah, that it might be. So as time has gone on, in my opinion, he has gone away from, I don't know, maybe I had something to do with it, to, nah, I don't think I had anything to do with it. I don't know why, but that's maybe an approach to answering Charles' question. With regard to Nils' concern about other folk suggesting or the possibility of people's minds having to do with the levitation of little craft and things like that, it seems to be unusual. That's really, I can't answer that because I have not been there. I don't know under what conditions, controlled conditions, these other phenomena have manifested themselves that you're talking about, that is certainly on all over the internet. And I don't have a coherent response to that. Maybe someone else does.
Right, but the principle of the scientific method is repeatability. So if you have an experiment and you can't repeat it, or nobody else can repeat it, you got to start asking the questions, well, maybe there's some conscious or poltergeist effect going on here.
At the moment, that's right.
Yeah.
That's
So you're saying the key is to always have several video cameras running at all times to capture everything, to document it then.
Right, but you got to repeat it. That's the big one. If you can't repeat it, you got to ask some serious questions.
Yeah.
George, do you think, that Hutchison, John, have changed to say, no, his mind has nothing to do? Is after taking so many chemicals to straighten up his mind, and now he cannot reproduce the effect anymore. Is that possible?
Or to add in, could it be like a fear of like the word psychic being like
Like
biased
blocking.
compared to consciousness, right? That he's trying to move away from the word, like it being a psychic ability compared to a scientific understanding of conscious, right? Where psychic is like the fringe science, and he's trying to move away from that.
Yes. John, when I first met him, he was not immersed in a milieu of you might say modern science. He had Tesla was one of his gods. as well as Marconi and the early pioneers. He did not at the time have a strong opinion about him being a scientist or John Hutchison being someone who can contribute to science. As time went on and scientists became aware, true and false scientists became aware of what John was doing, he said to himself, gee, science, I should be talking science, not psychics. I should be trying to portray myself as a scientist, which he was. I mean, he was exploring, he was experimenting, he was doing science, you might say, not in the way normally we consider, but he was doing science. And so it may be that as he wanted to portray himself as a scientist and talk the language of science to the best of his ability, he became less and less conversant, you might say, with the possibility of psi or psychic abilities, which I would say is sort of reasonable for someone to, if you're trying to attract, and he always was trying to attract a scientific explanation for what was going on. And to this day, he says, as far as I have talked to him quite a while ago, but I want science to understand. I want to find out what's going on science-wise. And unfortunately, science gets back to him and says, well, get rid of this psychic nonsense mumbo jumbo. Talk about fields and talk about wavelengths and talk about rise times and that kind of stuff. So John says, okay, I'll try to do that. And so he does to the best of his abilities, and sort of drifts away from that weird psychic mumbo jumbo. Anyway, I don't know if that also answers your question.
No, George, this has been amazing. It is amazing. I mean, I would say talk as long as you want, or if you know.
I only have about 10 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm
George,
super.
can we book you to come back though and do a full-on presentation in the future, please?
Well,
We have a full 2022, so anytime in the next year, you are welcome back to do so.
Yeah, George, I second that. You should come back.
I'll talk to Tim about that.
Yeah, I'll ask him what his scheduling is, and yeah. But yeah, George, I can't thank you enough for coming today. I mean, you know, and I can kind of muddle my way through it, but like really, I'm just kind of coming in after the fact and looking at like, you know.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And you've come in later on. I had the luxury or the bad luck, depending on how people look at me, of being there at the beginning and seeing for myself. I mean, I don't think anyone on this list or anywhere else, well, no, a couple of guys might still be alive who actually saw it with their own eyes, the majority of the major stuff that happened. But I appreciate your trying to pull together some kind of coherent story, Tim, and if I can help fill in some of the gaps, I'm honored to do so.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, really what I came away with was when I visited John, and again, I went up several times, but I noticed that in terms of the samples, like it wasn't you, because you did a really good documentation, but like, you know, these media channels and, you know, Coast to Coast AM and all that, they would describe this stuff. And it's like they missed a lot of bits and pieces that were important, you know. Yep. And like this effect starting in the middle of the aluminum bars, you know, I saw that with 2 or 3 of these samples and some other samples, and I was like, wait a minute, this matters, and nobody's reported this, you know. So yeah.
Well, I can talk about that a little bit too sometime.
I mean, do you think, I don't know, I just assumed it was some kind of a wavelength antenna idea, but
I wish it was, but there's no relationship, unfortunately, between the dimensions of the kinds of pieces that John has disrupted, you might say, and the any kind of recognizable wavelength in any of his apparatus or the fields. Certainly that I measured, there was no relationship. There was a general geometric relationship, as you're saying. Things would happen usually in the middle, or in the case of one of the files, it would divide into 4 pieces of more or less equal lengths. Trouble is, they would divide in ways that the magnetism you wouldn't expect if the bar was magnetized the file was magnetized the normal way. So it's really hard to make any generalizations about the relationship between the samples and what his so-called fields were. It'd be nice to, wonderful. Oh, there's a data point we can hang our hats on and say, if I see something that in my lab that has sort of a dark area in the middle, that means maybe I'm reproducing the Hutchison effect. That may be, but it's there's not really in my opinion, a hard and fast relationship. Sorry, I know there's no relationship between the kinds of fields that he was producing, at least when I was on board, and the geometry of the weird metallic activity or even non-metallic activity.
Yeah. Well, and he'd had other things too. He mentioned, what was it? He said there was a glow once. I'm not sure if you were with him with that. If I remember right, he said he put his hand into it or something like that.
Yeah,
I got 5 minutes, by the way.
I'm sorry. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer. Why don't we cut it short now, and I'll contact you if you're open to speaking more. But
yeah, well, there's a whole lot about the Hutchison effect. A lot of it's in the book that I hope folk can take a look at, or at least call Tom Vallone, who's been on this program before, as far as I understand, and order the book through Tom.
Yeah.
Can we do a day with George, Tom Vallone, and Michael?
Well, let me talk to George, because I know his schedule is busy and he has his own projects and stuff. But yeah, well, so I think for right now, why don't we let George go? But George, let me say very sincerely, thank you. It has been an absolute honor, guys. Let me do this. I want to put it on gallery view, and everyone, please give Mr. George Hathaway a giant applause.
All right.
For answering
Appreciate
questions that I would never in a million light years be able to answer on John's work. And so hopefully I was able to set a little bit of the stage, but thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yes, indeed. And,
Okay.
People can email me with questions if they wish. And
Please put your email in the private chat if you don't mind before you leave, George. Thank you so much for everything.
yeah, I can tell you it's pretty easy. It's George@hathawayresearch.com.
George@hathawayresearch.com. Okay.
Yeah, all one word.
Wonderful. Well, so let's do this then, George. Thank you yet again.